It began like most viral political clashes do these days, with a single insult hurled across social media. Rosie O'Donnell, known for her brash humor and fiery opinions, had taken to her podcast to mock Louisiana Senator John Kennedy. "That dumb hillbilly needs to go back to his porch and play his banjo," she said with a laugh, her co-host snickering in the background. The clip spread like wildfire within hours, shared across X, TikTok, and YouTube. Within a day, Kennedy's staff couldn't escape the noise. Memes, tweets, and late-night jokes all at his expense. But what nobody saw coming was how John Kennedy would respond. The Louisiana senator was not a man easily rattled. A Rhodes Scholar with a dry wit and a southern drawl that many mistook for naivety, he'd heard far worse. Yet, something about Rosie's words struck deeper, not because they insulted him personally, but because they played into the exact stereotype he'd spent decades dismantling, that Southerners and especially rural Americans were dumb. So when Kennedy arrived at his Senate office the next morning, coffee in hand and a half-smile on his face, he had already made a decision. He wasn't going to respond with anger. He was going to make a point. "Senator, do you want us to issue a statement?" asked his communications director, nervous and tired after a night of media calls. Kennedy shook his head. "No, ma'am. Statements are for people who want to sound busy. I'd rather show her." And that's exactly what he set out to do. 2 days later, Kennedy's office announced something unexpected. A new initiative called the American Mind Project, aimed at bringing free education programs, job training, and entrepreneurship mentorship to rural areas across the South. His first stop, his own home state. Reporters, of course, connected the dots immediately. CNN ran the headline, "Kennedy claps back at Rosie O'Donnell with a project." Fox News titled it, "Kennedy turns insult into inspiration." The story was everywhere. But Kennedy didn't comment. He simply smiled when asked and said, "Sometimes the best way to answer ignorance is with action." A week later, he arrived in Baton Rouge for the project's first town hall. The event was modest, held in a local high school gymnasium filled with teachers, small business owners, and students curious about the new program. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. Kennedy took the stage wearing his signature navy suit and red tie. He began not with statistics, not with political rhetoric, but with a story. "When I was a kid," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "I grew up in a little town where most folks worked with their hands. My daddy was a farmer, my mama was a schoolteacher, and we didn't have much, but we had sense. We knew that intelligence doesn't come from where you're born. It comes from what you learn and how you use it." The crowd nodded, silent and attentive. "Now, I've been called a lot of names in this town and beyond," he continued, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But being called a dumb hillbilly? That one made me chuckle. Because where I'm from, being a hillbilly means you work hard, tell the truth and keep your word. And I'll take that over Hollywood arrogance any day." The audience broke into laughter and applause. Cameras flashed. But Kennedy wasn't done. He shifted the tone, leaning on the podium. "This isn't about me. It's about every young person in small towns across America who's been told they're too poor, too country, too backward to make something of themselves. It's about the people who fix our cars, grow our food, and teach our kids, the ones the elites like to mock until they need them." By the end of his speech, the crowd was on its feet. The event trended online for days, with hashtags like #ProudHillbilly and #KennedyClapback dominating social media. Even some of Rosie's fans admitted the senator had handled it with surprising class. But Kennedy still wasn't finished. A week later, he did something that shocked both his supporters and critics. He sent Rosie O'Donnell a public invitation. "Ms. O'Donnell," his letter read, "you're welcome to join me in Louisiana anytime to meet some of the brightest and hardest working people I've ever known. You might discover that intelligence doesn't always come with a Hollywood accent." It was classic Kennedy, polite, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The media exploded. Talk shows debated whether Rosie would accept. Her fans urged her to ignore him, but the pressure built. Eventually, perhaps realizing the optics of backing down, she agreed. 2 weeks later, Rosie O'Donnell landed in Baton Rouge. Reporters swarmed her at the airport, microphones flashing. "Are you here to apologize?" one asked. She smiled tightly. "I'm here to see what all the fuss is about." The meeting took place in a modest community center filled with locals and press. Kennedy greeted her warmly, his Southern charm on full display. "Ms. O'Donnell," he said, shaking her hand, "welcome to the land of the so-called hillbillies." She laughed awkwardly. "Guess I walked right into that one." For the next few hours, Kennedy took her on a tour, first to a small vocational training center where young adults learned coding and robotics, then to a family-run farm that had partnered with the program to develop sustainable agriculture techniques. At each stop, locals greeted Rosie with warmth and humor. A group of high school students even presented her with a handmade t-shirt that read, "Smart Hillbillies Club." She laughed, taking pictures with them, visibly softening as the day went on. By the afternoon, they arrived at a small library built with grant funds from Kennedy's office. Inside, kids were learning STEM subjects using tablets and interactive software. Rosie watched quietly as one little girl proudly explained her coding project. "You built this yourself?" Rosie asked, crouching beside her. The girl nodded. "Senator Kennedy helped us get the computers. He says smart comes in all accents." Rosie smiled faintly, her expression shifting. "He's right." When the tour ended, Kennedy invited Rosie to speak briefly at the evening event. She hesitated, then agreed. That night, under string lights and a dusky Louisiana sky, Rosie O'Donnell stepped up to the microphone. Cameras zoomed in. The crowd fell silent. "I came here thinking I'd prove a point," she began. "But I think I've learned one instead. I joked about dumb hillbillies, but what I've seen today, the kids, the families, the work being done here, it's humbling. Maybe I needed this reminder that intelligence, kindness, and determination don't belong to any one zip code." The audience applauded, cautiously at first, then louder. When Rosie turned toward Kennedy, she smiled. "Senator, you got me good. Consider me schooled." Kennedy grinned. "Well, ma'am, we try to educate with hospitality down here." The clip of their exchange went viral almost instantly. News outlets hailed it as one of the most unexpected reconciliations in modern politics. Even comedians and late-night hosts praised Kennedy for turning an insult into a national moment of unity. But what most people didn't see was what happened afterward. A private conversation between Kennedy and Rosie as the crowd dispersed. "You didn't have to come," Kennedy told her. "Most folks in your shoes would have ignored me." Rosie looked thoughtful. "Yeah, well, maybe I've spent too long shouting from behind a microphone." Seeing all this, it reminded me what real people look like outside of the studio lights. Kennedy nodded. "We forget sometimes that politics ain't just about words. It's about people. And people deserve better than being turned into punchlines." They shook hands again, this time with genuine respect. Weeks later, Rosie mentioned the trip on her podcast. She admitted she'd been wrong, calling Kennedy a gentleman with a sharper mind than most give him credit for. She even announced a donation to the American Mind Project, helping fund scholarships for rural youth. As for Kennedy, he never gloated. In interviews, when asked about Rosie's change of heart, he simply said, "We're all human. We all say dumb things sometimes. The measure of a person is what they do after that." In the months that followed, the American Mind Project expanded beyond Louisiana, reaching Alabama, Mississippi, and West Virginia. Thousands of young people benefited, and Kennedy's approval ratings soared. But he refused to take full credit. "This isn't about politics," he told reporters. "It's about giving everyone, from the city to the smallest town, a fair shot at proving what they can do. Because brains aren't a luxury of the elite. They're a gift from God, and they grow best in the soil of opportunity." By the following year, Rosie and Kennedy even appeared together at a charity event in Washington, smiling on stage, an image that became symbolic of unlikely understanding in a divided time. When asked later how he managed to turn an insult into a movement, Kennedy chuckled softly. "My mama used to say, 'Don't wrestle with pigs, John. You both get dirty and the pig likes it.' But she also said, 'If someone calls you dumb, just outthink them until they run out of words.' That's all I did." And in that simple Southern wisdom lay the brilliance that so many had underestimated. Because John Kennedy hadn't just defended himself, he'd reminded the nation that humility and intelligence could coexist, that kindness could outshine cruelty, and that the best revenge isn't humiliation, it's elevation. From that day on, the phrase "dumb hillbilly" lost its sting. replaced instead by a quiet pride in the millions of Americans who knew exactly what Kennedy meant when he said, "Brains and grace don't care where you're born, only what you believe you can be."